Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margaret Boyle, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures. And I am also a faculty representative for the Accessibility Task Force on campus. And it's my extreme pleasure to welcome all of you to Bowdoin's inaugural lecture in Disability Studies and Accessibility. This new series is supported by the Harold and Iris Chandler Lectureship Fund, an endowment established by the family and friends in memory of Dr. Harold L. Chandler of the class of 1934. So the series is a partnership between the Accessibility Task Force, a campus committee comprised of faculty, staff, and students, and the Faculty Initiative for Health, Culture, and Society. And the mission of the series is to support an annual lecture in critical disability studies and accessibility on the Bowdoin campus. And I'd like to thank the Departments of Theater and Dance, English, Visual Arts, Romance, Languages, and Literatures, and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies for their support with this lecture. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the Events Office, particularly Michelle Morin and Dana Hopkins, for their help and many emails coordinating this series and for making a live stream of today's lecture possible. Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Rosemarie Garland Thomson, a professor of English and Bioethics at Emory University and the co-director of the Disability Studies Initiative. Professor Garland Thomson is a leading voice on disability and accessibility within the health humanities and is a celebrated public intellectual. Her 2016 editorial, Becoming Disabled, was the inaugural article in the ongoing weekly series in the New York Times about disability by people living with disabilities. Her work aims to raise public consciousness about and advocate for disability inclusion and equity. Recognized as a senior scholar by the Society for Disability Studies in recognition for her contributions to the field, Professor Garland Thomson is the author of Staring, How We Look, and Extraordinary Bodies, Figuring Physical Disability in American Literatures and Cultures. She's also edited the following volumes: Representing Disability, Activism and Agency in the Museum, Disability Studies, Enabling the Humanities, and the anthology Freakery. And on a personal note, as a graduate student, I was fortunate enough to have Rosemarie as my introduction to the discipline of disability studies. And over these last 14 years, I've looked to Rosemarie as a mentor and example as I've taken on the work of accessibility for our campus. Rosemarie's academic essays can be found in a wide range of journals, including Literature and Medicine, the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal, Journal of Medical Humanities, American Journal of Bioethics, Disability Studies Quarterlies, Signs, and Feminist Studies. A number of students, faculty, and staff today had the opportunity to meet with Professor Garland Thomson as she spoke with us, along with Emily Black, about work that we can continue to do on Bowdoin's campus in the classroom and kind of more broadly in our communities. I'm very excited to welcome Professor Garland Thomson to speak with us today, so please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Margaret, for the invitation to be here. I'm really honored to give an inaugural lecture in disability studies and accessibility, and I'm particularly pleased that you're putting disability studies and accessibility together in the same initiative title. I think that's really important. I also want to acknowledge and thank Professor David Hecht and President Clayton Rose for making it possible for me to be here, and once again to Margaret for planning this and for everything that we have been able to do together. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate it. I have a rather ambitious presentation this afternoon in the sense that it's long and perilous because it has video embedded in it, which I hope will work fairly well. So I will try to move through this quickly and make this as accessible a presentation as I possibly can. So my title is Disability Studies from Theory to Practice, Finding Bioethics in the Frankenstein Ballet. I'm going to talk a bit about my new work in bioethics and to talk a little bit about why I decided to take on bioethics as I make this presentation, because I wanted to move disability studies as I practiced it from a theoretical and critical enterprise into a practical or applied enterprise, which is what bioethics is. So I'll be talking about where I have found bioethical issues in a piece of literary and artistic production. So I'm going to begin with perhaps one of the most fundamental critical assumptions of disability studies as a field, and that is disability is everywhere once you know how to look for it. And we're going to look for disability together today. So a few claims, a few definitions before I begin with my explication. So the human variations that we think of as disabilities, and this is the way I like to talk about disability, are a part of the human condition that occur in every family, every life, and that are a theme in all art and culture. And this is what I'm going to be talking a little bit more about today. And I'm showing some illustrations here in all of my slides. This is a funerary statue of the dwarf Seneb from Giza to show you that disability is a part of every family throughout history. So here's a definition of disability. This is my own definition that I like. It's rather poetic. This is one way of thinking about the human variations that we call disability. And that is, disability is a record written on the body of our encounters between flesh and world. And I'm showing you some illustrations. Here's some portraits of people with disabilities, and I'll return to some of these. The lived experience of disability, I want to claim here, provides people and communities, so individuals and their communities, with multiple opportunities for expression, creativity, resourcefulness, relationships, and flourishing. So I'm going to talk about what disability makes, what it does. I'm going to talk against disability as understood as a lack, as a form of inferiority, as a deficit model of existence. I'm going to talk about disability in a different way with you this afternoon. So, disability, I want to suggest, is an opportunity to explore, this is specifically, to explore, redefine, and make new representations of the human body. And I'll be talking about a number of representations of the human body for the rest of the time that we're together here today. So our representations, that is to say our images, our pictures, our stories of the human variations that we think of disabilities, are made out of building blocks. And those things that make these representations are words, pictures, gestures, and objects. And I'm going to focus today on gestures when I talk about the Frankenstein Ballet and about dance gestures and a whole vocabulary of gesture that is meaning-making in the genre of dance. So where do we find disability culture? So I'm going to be talking a lot about disability culture. It's not generally understood that there is a culture of disability, but there is, for the reasons that I have already outlined. And I'm going to try to show you and talk about where we find disability culture. So we can say that we find it in three places, simply: in literature, in art, and in dance, or gestural movement, gestural narrative, if you will. It's also found in other places, but I want to talk about visual representations today. So, an important claim here is that the representation of disability crosses all genre, all media, all time periods, all aesthetic themes, and all cultures. And I'm going to try to encapsulate that a little bit for you when I talk a bit about disability culture in literature, art, and dance. So I'm going to start with just a few illustrations of where we find disability in literature and in the media arts. So from the founding narrative of Western culture, Oedipus the King, of course, this turns on the human experience of disability. You may remember that Oedipus has a damaged foot, and of course at the end of the play he blinds himself. So disability is crucial to the narrative of Oedipus, the founding narrative of Western culture. We find the theme of monsters, creatures, prodigies in a wide range of literature, and I'll be talking, of course, more about that today. We have, for example, Caliban, who is a creature or a monster in Shakespeare's The Tempest. We have, of course, Frankenstein. I'm showing here Boris Karloff in the famous movie of Frankenstein. We also have actual people whose biographies are a part of the genre of creatureliness. Here, the Elephant Man, Joseph Merrick, here shown in the film. Literature, of course, deals always with disability. Some of the most important of all Western literature in English and other languages centers on disability. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, the consumptive Eva is the central figure. Charles Dickens writes, of course, sentimental narratives such as A Christmas Carol, in which disability is central to the theme. In American literature, which is my field, in the 19th century, the most important novel is Moby Dick, which centers on, of course, a disabled protagonist, Captain Ahab. The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner in the 20th century centers on Benji Compson, who is a protagonist with a developmental disability. We also have, of course, literature made by people with disabilities. Here's an example. This is the poet Paul Guest, who is a man with quadriplegia, and I call him a mouth stick poet because when he reads his poetry, he scrolls through that poetry with a mouth stick, and it gives a very distinctive characteristic to his readings. We also have quite a vibrant literature, if you will, in popular culture that comes from people with disabilities and about disability. Here is the disabled comedian Maison Zaid in her really famous and much watched 2013 TED Talk. She is a woman with cerebral palsy who is what she calls a sit-down comedian. There are many television shows and series that feature disability. Here's just one. This is for disabled glamour girls who use wheelchairs in a series called Push Girls. And of course, there is Peter Dinklage that everyone seems to know from the Game of Thrones. He's a person of small stature or a dwarf. Maureen Dowd, I love this, calls him the first dwarf heartthrob, which seems accurate to me. He's looking really cute on the cover of this Esquire magazine. There's much new media. This is just one example of the short film. This is a film called Can You Read My Lips? It's about the ASL using lip reading deaf scholar who actually is one of the graduate students I work with, Rachel Kolb, who is the first ASL using deaf Rhodes Scholar. And this is an award-winning 5-minute film. So art and design. Again, I'm going to be brief, but to give you a little bit of an overview of where we might find disability. So I want to suggest that we can find disability in visual art in 3 ways. First of all, disability as a subject of art. Here we have from 1568 a picture by Peter Bruegel of cripples out about in the world. On a vase from an early Greek amphora, we have here a person of small stature or a person with dwarfism featured. John Singer Sargent in 1918 uses protest painting to protest against the use of gassing in World War I. This painting is called Gassed. In 1938, Jacob Lawrence paints Blind Beggars, a scene of beggars in Harlem. in the Harlem Renaissance. These are just examples. Disability also shapes art, that is to say, artists who themselves have disability, who have bodies, who relate to their works of art, and whose bodies inflect their works of art in particular ways. Of course, Frida Kahlo, the wheelchair-using artist, is one good example of this, and I'm showing you a couple of her self-portraits here. Claude Monet, who becomes increasingly blind, like most people will, as he grows older. His late works become increasingly impressionistic simply because he sees the world differently as he becomes more and more blind later and later in life. Vincent van Gogh, of course, inflects his work with the subject of his own disability, his mental illness, if you will, which is indicated here in interesting ways in this self-portrait with bandaged ear. As we know, of course, he's famous for having cut his own ear in some sort of a psychiatric episode when he was institutionalized. There are many self-portraits. I've shown a couple of them to you. This is a little bit more contemporary. This is by Nancy Fried. There's an entire genre of self-representation of women who have had mastectomies. This is simply one example from 1994 of a one-breasted Amazonian woman. Disability, of course, is found in art as well as a concept. This is an illustration, a line drawing by Neil Marcus. This very famous picture, of course, The Woman in the Blue Hat by Pablo Picasso, puts forward the idea of asymmetry, which of course is understood as one of the principles of disability embodiment. So while Picasso isn't necessarily painting a picture here of a disabled person, he is conceptualizing a principle of disability diversity in this very famous painting of a woman with both eyes on the same side of her nose. The contemporary sound artist, who is a deaf ASL-using artist, Christine Sun Kim, does some very, very interesting things with sound art. I think this is particularly worthy of following up on because sound, of course, is a human experience that is not accessible to people who are deaf, but Christine Sun Kim's work shows us that sound is a principle and experience of deaf people as well as hearing people. Catherine Sherwood is an artist from UC Berkeley with disabilities, and she uses a representational strategy of revising famous paintings. Here we have Olympia, Manet's famous Venus, that is changed, inflected with Catherine Sherwood's own apparatuses of being. Her leg brace and the head of this Venus is made from Catherine Sherwood's brain imaging scans. This is a work by Jessie Park, who is a woman who is neurodiverse, and this expresses her understanding of the world as a person with neurodiversity. The sculpture artist, Judith Scott, who was a woman who was deaf and had Down syndrome, is a sculpture artist who raps, and she has done a number of really wonderful pieces in which she simply takes fiber and wraps them. And in this particular piece, which I really like, she's wrapped the wheel of a wheelchair into this sculpture. Sandy Yee, who is a disabled artist with unusual hands and feet, has designed shoes for her unusual shoes for her unusual feet. This is Kathy D. Woods, who is a fashion designer. She designs clothes for small people, and she is herself a small person in need of professional clothes that fit her properly. There is an emerging genre of prosthetic devices that are designed for functionality, but also designed to be looked at, designed not to be hidden, designed as aesthetic objects. This comes from the Alternative Limb Project. I particularly like this Eames chair-inspired prosthetic leg by Joanna Hawley, and I think it's interesting that this man is displaying, again, his Eames chair leg rather than hiding it, which was the classic way to present prosthetic legs in a pre-ADA time. Of course, the international symbol of access, which has been redesigned in 2010 by Sarah Hendren, is the guide for all of us to accessible pathways, and this has become an iconic symbol throughout our entire built and rebuilt world. And of course, the ramp itself, which has evolved in the United States since about 1968, when it was mandated that public buildings, or that federally funded public buildings, needed to be accessible to people with disabilities, has evolved into beautiful aesthetic forms. This is the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which of course is a pre-ADA building, but it has a beautiful helical ramp on the inside, and a brand new building, the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, with the red ramp at the very center of the building. So I'm going to complete my time with you here today to talk, as I promised, about dance and what I call gestural narratives. That is to say, narratives that are made from movements, gestures, made by the human body in particular very, very highly conventional forms, both classical ballet and contemporary dance. So I'll give you some examples here of some of the disability dance genres that I'm familiar with. This is 5 Foot Feet, which is a small dance troupe. I don't think it's operating anymore, that has 3 people, one of whom is an amputee, so together they have 5 feet. This is Leroy Moore, who is the creator of what he calls crip hop, which is, of course, a particular kind of hip-hop movement that Leroy invented. And Leroy is a person with cerebral palsy, which gives him a very distinctive movement vocabulary, which he incorporates into crip hop. Bill Shannon, who goes by the name Crutchman, is a crutch user who has designed specific crutches with rockers on the bottom to invent an entire choreographic vocabulary of breakdancing which uses crutches. This is Claire Cunningham, who again incorporates into her dance performance the use of a crutch. It's interesting, she has an arm crutch here around her neck, which is a very interesting use of crutches. She has 4 crutches total here, 1 on her neck, 1 on each arm, and 1 on her foot in this unusual choreographic form. There are several dancers. Here I'm showing you David Toole, who is a UK dancer, and he is a legless person, and the late Homer Avila, who is a one-leg dancer. I find it particularly interesting to think about what kind of contributions dancers that dance either with no legs or with one leg might contribute to the form, because of course it is understood that legs and dancing on legs is one of the primary components of what counts as actual dance. So I'm going to show you, I hope, a video here of Kinetic Light, which is one of the newer companies of disabled dancers. So let me see. This is a little small, but you can perhaps get a feel for this. This is 2 dancers, and they are dancing on wheels instead of dancing on legs. And the stage has a very stylistic ramp in which they use in order to harness the force of gravity in order to move the chairs around in developing this dance vocabulary for this particular performance. So this is just a couple of minutes. One of the distinctive things about this particular performance is not just the use of the wheelchair, but the wheelchair as an aesthetic object. And it has been argued that the wheelchair has transformed dance in the same way that the toe shoe transformed dance. And we're also seeing a very interesting collection of light in this particular performance. And we have here Alice Shepard, who is the lead dancer, and Laurel Lawson up at the top of the ramp working together in developing, again, this choreographic vocabulary distinctive to dancers that dance on wheels and on floor more than on legs. We have Alice Shepard at the top of the ramp and Laurel Lawson on the floor in, again, these particularly vigorous virtuosity moves which involve a certain strength and virtuosity that would not be possible without the use of the chair. And here's a still of Alice Shepard and Laurel Lawson together. So I'm going to talk for the rest of the time here together with you, as I promised, about Frankenstein. So let me talk a little bit about Frankenstein as a cultural icon, if you will. So Frankenstein, as I'm sure many of you know, is published in 1818, and I'm showing here one of the original photograph of the original publications of Frankenstein. And it is written by Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley. And I'm showing you an image of Mary Shelley here on the left, who is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who's a very well-known intellectual of the 18th century, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and this is Mary Shelley's mother. Mary Shelley's father is the very well-known political philosopher William Godwin, and Mary Shelley was married to, of course, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who is one of the most important romantic poets of the 18th and 19th century in England. And this is all three of them together. This is the covers of Mary Shelley's parents, Vindication of the Rights of Women, and an inquiry concerning political justice that is written by Mary Shelley's father. So this just gives you an idea of the intellectual tradition that Mary Shelley uses and comes from in writing this story that she writes when she's actually a very, very young girl in 1818. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the book itself, but just to give you a bit of a background. The story Frankenstein, of course, which is basically a ghost story, or it's a science fiction story. It's sometimes understood as the earliest science fiction written in English, has been adapted very, very widely. It's been taken up in culture, as we all know, in various ways. I'm showing you an image here of course, Mel Brooks' famous film that all of us love, Young Frankenstein, and a picture of Boris Karloff, which is the kind of Frankenstein monster figure that most of us are familiar with from the film and from countless Halloween costumes and a variety of other images. It's this particular image of Frankenstein, of course it's not Frankenstein, of the monster or the creature from the story of Frankenstein that haunts our popular imagination just now in products ranging from food to cartoons to every imaginable kind of iteration of this particular monstrous Frankenstein figure that is, again, the monster. However, what I'm going to talk about here is something quite different, a very different adaptation of Mary Shelley's story of Victor Frankenstein and his creature, and this comes from the ballet version of Frankenstein, and I'm showing you images that come from the DVD of the London Royal Opera House performance. I think it's 2017. I saw the performance in San Francisco, which is the same performance with different dancers, twice in 2018. So I'll talk a lot about costuming and choreography as we go through the slides and some of the clips here, but I want to call attention at the beginning of some of the particularities about ballet as a dance form that both limit the kind of story that can be told and also create the context of its possibilities. So one thing, of course, about a dance as a gestural narrative, in other words, a form of story, is that it is performed, so it's highly visual, and it is performed by actual people in real time before an audience. So the context of its presentation and reception is very specific, and the limits of what can be expressed are really very strict within ballet, as opposed to, say, other media such as film or art, where there can be quite a number of departures from, let's say, the human form. This is part of what I think is the possibility here, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. I'm showing here an image of the creature, who, of course, is called the creature, not a monster, in Mary Shelley's text, and I think it's very important that he be understood as a creature because the term monster has a different set of meanings for us today than it might have in earlier periods. So we'll call this character, as Mary Shelley does, the creature. Of course, the creature is created by Victor Frankenstein, and we'll talk a little bit more about the plot in case you need a bit of a reminder. So this is an image of one of the 2 or 3 parts of the setting. They're important. This is the area where the creature lives. This is the setting which shows the creature in the forest. And you can note perhaps that the creature, of course, is naked. And the creature is very pale and streaked with scarring and blood stains. So I'll talk a little bit more about costuming here. In order to give a bioethical reading to this story, I have connected it with a book that I think is a very important book by Andrew Solomon called Far from the Tree. This is a study of families and how they adjust to, or don't, but particularly adjust to, how they adapt to, how they operate when a child comes into the family that is very different from its parents. And Andrew Solomon's book deals with a variety of different families who have children with what we might call different kinds of distinctivenesses. There are several families that he deals with who have children with what we would think of as disabilities. There are a few other kinds of differentness that he introduces as well, like the child that is the prodigy or the child that is the mass murderer. And these are children that are absorbed into, in one way or another, families who are different from those children. And this is the context in which I'm going to read the Frankenstein Ballet, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. So a little bit of the story. When the ballet opens, and I was really worried about this when I went to see it, it felt at the beginning very nutcracker-ish in the sense that it's very classic. There's a family gathering, and the Frankenstein family is coming together there in Vienna, I think. And this is, I'm showing you a picture of the mother, Victor Frankenstein's mother, and one of the servants. There's lots of dancing servants in the first act. And the first act sets up the scene of the Frankenstein family. Very conventional. They all look alike because, of course, they're all ballet dancers. They have 18th century aristocratic costumes. They're generally a happy family until, of course, the mother that I'm showing here on the left dies in childbirth suddenly. And this, of course, is the plot device that launches the story of Frankenstein in the ballet. So this is the first act, and Victor, at the end of the first act, heartbroken, having lost his mother in childbirth. So there's a brother that comes from this childbirth who will feature later in the story. Victor goes off to medical school in Act 2. Oh, I'm sorry, here are some images of the nutcracker-ish aspect of it, of the ballet. And so my point is that the main gestural form of a ballet is what we know as a pas de deux, and that is a duet, a danced duet, usually between a male lead and a female lead. And in the first act of Frankenstein, we have a number of these pas de deux. And my reading of the ballet is that these pas de deux change throughout the entire ballet, and that they express the theme and the action of the ballet in different ways, and I'll show you some of these pas de deux. But at the beginning, we have very classical pas de deux. Here are pas de deux of Victor. These are different performances, which is why they look different, and his betrothed, whose name is Elizabeth, and they are dancing here in the first act. She grows up with them. She's an orphan child who comes to live in the family, so she's kind of a sister and then a wife to Victor. So this is Victor and Elizabeth in classical pas de deux, very recognizable in terms of costuming and form and gestural vocabulary. So when Victor goes off to medical school, everything really changes for him. This is a Faustian kind of a scene in which we have dancing nurses and dancing medical students, and in the very center of this anatomy theater is a gurney with a covered body on it. And I'm going to show you the creation scene. So what happens is they dance and dance and dance, and Victor is left alone. His professor is trying to use galvanism to make the dead body come alive, and he fails to do that, and everyone goes off to the tavern to have a good time, and the sort of depressive and contemplative Victor stays in the anatomy theater and decides he's going to try his professor's experiment. So we have Victor and the body on the gurney, which is all chopped up, and he moves around doing classical balletic gestures by himself. He's feeling very creative, optimistic, and there's this large galvanistic machine that hangs above the corpse on the gurney. And Victor takes the body parts and puts them together to suture the body together. And we see some of this before. And there's this dramatic moment in which Victor, now remember, a ballet has no words. So everything needs to be done through gesture, and the music is really only an accompaniment. So this is the moment of creativity here where Victor makes a living creature through infusing this creature with electricity. So we have lightning and sparks and drama and kind of Willy Wonka-looking machines. And Victor's dramatic gestures in his attempt to give life to dead flesh. A lot of really interesting lighting here. And the creature has gone up high in the anatomy theater and comes down on the gurney. And we witness the dead body. Victor straddles his creature to test, to see if the creature has been given life. He consults a book that he's received from his father, the Book of Knowledge. He's convinced that he's failed. He's stricken. The body is still. Victor takes his coat, slumps to the floor, puts away the book, and is despondent. And then a hand raises. A breath is taken. Victor recognizes something's going on. And the creature embraces his creator. And Victor, of course, is horrified, throws his coat at the creature. And this newborn creature runs out of the room, leaving Victor astonished and horrified. So let me talk a little bit about the creature's costume here and a bit about the plot. So the creature runs off with Victor's coat, and Victor is tormented. So we have several scenes of Victor's torment. What we learn is that Victor refuses to tell anyone about the creature. In other words, he refuses to recognize the creature's existence. He refuses to recognize the creature's legitimacy as a member of the human community, and certainly as a member of the Frankenstein family. The creature, of course, because the creature is a ballet dancer, must look almost exactly like Victor. Now, this is very different from the novel, where the creature is large. We don't really know what the creature looks like in the novel very much. What we do know is that the creature scares the pants off of everyone that he comes in contact with. But because we don't see the creature in the novel, there is a certain imaginative capacity about what the creature might look like. In a ballet, we have to know at all times exactly what the creature or any of the characters look like. And so I think this is an opportunity for the dance narrative and the gestural form to tell a very interesting story. So the story that gets told here is about the refusal of the creator, the father, Victor Frankenstein, to recognize, to acknowledge his creation, his son, if you will, the person or the being that he has made in its distinctiveness from him. So they have the same form, they have the same size, they have more or less the same gender. They look very different from one another in two ways. One is through costuming. Victor has 18th century aristocratic clothes on. The creature is naked, covered with scars and blood. And the creature cannot enter into the society of the Frankenstein family. The creature lives in the forest and haunts the Frankenstein family manor. And so all of the action of the film takes place in the Frankenstein family manor and in the yard between the forest where the creature lives and the Frankenstein family manor. So this is an image of the creature, tortured as he is in his loneliness, in his attempts over and over again to enter into the Frankenstein family, which will not accept him. And this is what happens. This is the cautionary tale of the tragedy that ensues when a family refuses to recognize the differences and the distinctions in a family member. So the creature attempts to enter into the gestures and the participation of the Frankenstein family by watching them, watching what they do, watching them dance, basically. And he'll put on the coat in some scenes. And in this scene, for example, he's attempting to show the deference and to do the bowing that is typical of course, 18th century aristocratic families and the dance forms that the Frankenstein family uses. So in the next scene, we have Victor's brother, William, who is born when Victor's mother dies, at his 8th birthday. And they are playing blind man's bluff. And everyone leaves at the end of the birthday party, and the 8-year-old boy, William, is by himself on the stage. And out from the forest comes the creature with Victor's coat on to engage in a series of really lovely pas de deux in which they play together and they bow to each other, and the creature tries to mimic and use the different dance forms that are typical of a classic pas de deux. Well, the problem, of course, occurs when William actually takes off his blindfold and sees the creature and becomes hysterically frightened by this. And the creature tries to silence him, and in trying to silence him, he kills him. So this is an accidental death. And he's horrified by the fact that he's killed this young boy that he's trying to befriend, that he's trying to relate to in some way. And he runs off. And here's an image of them in the Frankenstein yard together when the creature is imploring the young William to stop screaming or to pay it. No, he's not screaming there, to pay attention to him. So what happens then is that after the creature has accidentally killed William, he becomes even more of an outcast, and his importuning changes to a certain bitterness. And he approaches Victor himself at one point, when Victor is out in the yard of the Frankenstein family by himself, and he comes up behind him and threatens him with another embrace. And I'm showing you an image of this kind of embrace, very similar to the one in the creation scene, in which he wants to be held, he wants to be touched, he wants to be looked at and seen as he is by Victor Frankenstein, who refuses to turn around and face him. And here is a scene of the two of them doing their tortured pas de deux of recognition. This is the father leaving. This is the Frankenstein yard where much of the action takes place. It's the liminal space between the manor and the forest. And what you see is a choreography of refusal here, in which Victor will not turn toward his creation. And the creature then embraces his creator. This is the mother's locket. The creature's forcing Victor to recognize him, and they engage in this fight, a pas de deux that is part balletic and part contemporary dance. And the entire gestural scene is the creature asking his creator to recognize him, and Victor refusing. That's Elizabeth's shawl. So this is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen. Because of course what the creature has asked, and this isn't important in the ballet, is for Victor to create a companion for the creature. And Victor refuses. In the next scene, it's the marriage scene. So Victor and Elizabeth are married, and there is classical pas de deux between Victor and Elizabeth, of course, that we see. And in the wedding scene, there's a corps de ballet performance in which all of the guests in the Frankenstein family are gathered together doing this, as I said, corps de ballet dance, and we see the creature entering with this red velvet jacket on, and dancing in among the wedding guests. And of course, Victor sees him there, and Victor is terrified. And at this point, the creature is no longer imploring. He's no longer, he's no longer asking for inclusion. He is bitter, and he is seeking revenge for his rejection at this point. You can see it in the expression on his face here. And after, of course, the wedding guests have dispersed because the creature actually kills Victor's best friend and his father, what we have left on the stage is the creature and Elizabeth, the bride. And they have an extended pas de deux that I want to show you. In which classical balletic moves and gestures give way to a much more dramatic and almost violent set of contemporary dance gestural movements that you're seeing a little bit in here. So it's a pas de deux with a lot of floor work, which is not typical of classical ballet, but very typical of contemporary dance gestures. So we get an interesting hybrid here of gestural forms. It's almost a rape scene. And of course, it's a murder scene because the creature is going to kill Elizabeth. And there's one of the friends on the stairs. So what the creature has done, because Victor refuses to recognize him, is killed everyone that Victor loves. And there's a final pas de deux between Victor and the creature in which they both have on aristocratic velvet coats, which is very beautiful, in which you see expressed in the dance form of the pas de deux the parallels, the twinningness of the two opposites, the creature and his creator. And this particular image, I think, is very indicative of this, where they really are almost exactly the same, except in their difference in costuming. And this indicates, of course, the lost possibilities of alignment and acceptance and recognition that might have taken place. But at this point, the creature has killed everyone that Victor loves, and so there is no possibility of resolution. And Here's another image of the final pas de deux, in which we have a setting in the background of something blazing. Whether it's the future or the Frankenstein family manor, it's hard to know, but again, the pas de deux is very distinctive from the original ones, in which the principal dancers hold one another up. The male dancer holds up the female dancer, and this is almost wrestling here between these two opposing and yet twin figures. And I'll show you the final scene here, which is very powerful. So Victor kills himself with the gun, and the creature falls to his knees because he is devastated. What he has tried to do is to get Victor's love and attention. He straddles Victor in the same way that Victor straddled the creature in the creation scene. He searches the book that Victor had looked at to see how he could make Victor come alive. And it's a scene of intense tenderness, a kind of pietà. Of despair and longing. And like Oedipus, the creature goes down the road. So my point is that the balletic adaptation of the novel, which of course requires a good deal of interpretation and change in order to move from one form, narrative form, into another narrative form, is an opportunity for us to think about the ethics of family acceptance and rejection. And it's able to use some of the conventions of classical tragedy. It feels a little bit like Hamlet, it feels a little bit like Othello, to tell a tale of how children need to be accepted into families as they are. So I wanted to finish up by talking about how we might be able to find disability where it is, and what the tradition of disability as an aesthetic and a narrative resource might be able to offer us. And I want to suggest that what we can perhaps do with finding disability culture is to develop a concept that I'm calling disability cultural competence, which means that people with disabilities, which could mean all of us, need to know our history. We need to know our culture. We need to know our arts. We need to know our technology, and we need to know our rights. I can talk a little bit more about this and have, but I just wanted to gesture toward that now. And what would this do if maybe many of us, all of us, were able to learn disability cultural competence? And I want to suggest that what it could do and what it should do is to strengthen support for disability culture and presence and awareness across all civic institutions, that it could help us develop practices that implement disability inclusion, diversity, and justice, that we could learn to build inclusive environments that support all human embodied flourishing, that we could learn to shape environments to fit humans rather than shaping humans to fit environments, that we could promote the development of bioethical, cultural, technological, and legal supports for people living with disabilities as we are. And what this could accomplish is that it could change attitudes, it could increase access, it could build community, and it could cultivate leadership. And this is part of what a disability studies initiative, this is part of what critical disability studies in educational settings, accessibility and critical accessibility studies, if you will, could offer higher education. So, thank you. I believe we might have a minute or two for questions. Thank you for your patience. I'm also happy to speak afterward to anyone who wants to make a comment. Yes. Thank you.